You know how sometimes you get invited to a party and you're pretty sure it's because someone felt sorry for you? Well, that's exactly how Commander Jake Morrison felt when the shiny holographic invitation materialized on his desk aboard the human frigate Lucky Break. The Galactic Defense Coalition, you know, the fancy alien club that usually treated humans like the special needs kid in advanced calculus, was cordially requesting his presence at an emergency war council on Nexus Prime. Oops Morrison, as his crew affectionately called him, stared at the floating message with the kind of expression you'd expect from someone who'd just been asked to perform brain surgery with a butter knife. The nickname wasn't exactly flattering, but it was earned through years of accidentally stumbling into military victories that should have been catastrophic defeats. Like that time he'd meant to retreat but hit the wrong button and ended up ramming a pirate mothership. Or when he'd gotten lost during a stealth mission and somehow discovered an entire enemy base that intelligence had been hunting for months. The invitation was signed by Admiral Vextar himself, a being so uptight that his species had evolved special muscles just for looking disapproving. The fact that they were asking for human input meant one thing: they were absolutely, completely, and utterly screwed. Jake scratched his head, wondering if this was some kind of elaborate prank. Humans had only been part of the coalition for about 5 years, but ever since they'd accidentally made first contact by literally bumping into an alien patrol while testing a new FTL drive. The aliens had been expecting some grand gesture of intelligence and sophistication. Instead, they got Captain Murphy saying, "Oops, sorry about that, didn't see you there over the radio." The message mentioned something about the Void Syndicate, a mysterious enemy that had been systematically erasing star systems from existence, of entire civilizations, gone without a trace. No survivors, no debris, just empty space where thriving worlds used to be. The Coalition's best minds had been working on the problem for 2 years with absolutely zero progress. Their most advanced strategies, their most sophisticated technologies, their most brilliant tactical minds, all useless against an enemy they couldn't even properly identify. And now they wanted to consult the humans, the species that had discovered faster than light travel by accident and whose greatest military achievement was convincing pirates to surrender by playing polka music at maximum volume until they gave up out of sheer annoyance. Jake shrugged and hit the reply button. Sure, why not? I'll bring snacks. 3 days later, he found himself standing in the most secure facility in the known galaxy, that surrounded by beings that could probably calculate PI to 1,000,000 decimal places in their heads while simultaneously composing symphonies and curing diseases. The Nexus Prime War Room was a marvel of alien engineering. Holographic displays showed real-time tactical information from across the galaxy. The quantum computers processed battle scenarios faster than light could travel. And the coffee machine could apparently achieve consciousness if you asked it nicely. Jake was looking for the bathroom when he accidentally walked into a maintenance corridor and overheard Admiral Vextar talking to someone in hushed, panicked tones. "The projections are clear," Vextar was saying, his voice carrying that special kind of desperation usually reserved for tax audits and family reunions. "We lose another system every 72 hours. At this rate, the Void Syndicate will reach the core worlds within 6 months. "What about the new battle plans?" asked another voice, female, with the kind of accent that suggested she probably had more PhD equivalents than most planets had universities. "Useless. Every strategy we deploy, they counter perfectly. It's as if they know our every move before we make it." Jake tried to back away quietly, but his foot caught on something and he stumbled into a wall panel, which promptly activated with a cheerful beeping sound that echoed through the corridor like a dinner bell in a library. What was that? Vextar's voice went from panic to paranoid in record time. Jake did what any reasonable person would do in that situation. He pretended to be lost and confused, which wasn't really pretending. The War Council chamber looked like someone had crossed a United Nations meeting with a science fiction movie and then added way too much chrome. Representatives from 47 different species sat around a table that probably cost more than Earth's entire military budget, but all of them staring at holographic displays with the kind of intense concentration usually reserved for disarming nuclear weapons or parallel parking. Admiral Vextar stood at the head of the table, his four arms gesturing at a three-dimensional star map that showed the galaxy looking like it had a serious case of cosmic acne. Red zones marked where entire systems had simply vanished, creating a pattern that looked disturbingly organized. Honorable representatives. Vextar began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd been delivering bad news for so long that optimism had become a foreign concept. We face an unprecedented threat. The Void Syndicate has destroyed 43 systems in the past 18 months. Our projections indicate they possess technology beyond our current understanding. Counselor Blim, a nervous little being who looked like someone had crossed a ferret with a calculator, was frantically taking notes on a device that projected holographic text faster than most people could read. The economic implications alone are staggering, he muttered, apparently oblivious to the fact that economics becomes somewhat irrelevant when your entire civilization gets deleted from existence. General Thok, who belonged to a warrior species that had apparently evolved from something with too many teeth and not enough patience, slammed one of his 6 fists on the table. Enough analysis. We should strike first, strike hard, strike without mercy. With respect, General, Vextar replied in the tone of voice usually reserved for explaining things to particularly slow children. We cannot strike an enemy we cannot locate, but using tactics that have failed repeatedly. Jake raised his hand like he was back in elementary school. Excuse me, but have you guys tried, looking for patterns in where they attack? Maybe checking if there's some kind of strategic logic to their target selection? The silence that followed was the kind you get when someone suggests that maybe the Emperor's new clothes aren't actually that fashionable after all. 46 pairs of alien eyes turned to stare at Jake with expressions ranging from polite confusion to barely concealed horror. Commander Morrison, Vextar said slowly, our quantum analytical engines have processed over 4 billion possible strategic combinations. If there were patterns, we would have found them. Right, but sometimes the obvious stuff gets missed when you're thinking too hard, Jake said, completely missing the fact that he'd just insulted the collective intelligence of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy. Like back home, we had this problem with car theft and everyone was installing fancy security systems and tracking devices. But it turned out the thieves were just targeting cars with those little pine tree air fresheners because they figured the owners were the type who'd leave spare keys under the floor mats. You see. The silence got even more awkward, which Jake hadn't thought was possible. Perhaps, said Counselor Blim delicately, we should focus on our established protocols. Our battle plans have been refined over centuries of warfare. The Stratgos system has proven effective against every enemy we've encountered. Except this one, Jake pointed out helpfully. Yes, well, that's why we're implementing the enhanced Stratgos system, Vextar said, activating a holographic display that showed what looked like the galaxy's most complicated flowchart. Phase 1 involves diversionary attacks on 17 sectors to mask our true intentions. Phase 2 deploys our fastest ships in a coordinated pincer movement. Phase 3. Bathroom break. Jake announced suddenly because he'd been sitting there for 2 hours and apparently alien coffee went through humans faster than a tax refund through a shopping mall. He wandered out into the corridor, following signs written in 47 different languages, none of which seemed to include bathroom in any recognizable form. After 10 minutes of increasingly desperate searching, he found a door marked with what he hoped was the universal symbol for restroom but might have been a warning about explosive decompression. It turned out to be a supply closet, but while he was backing out, he accidentally bumped into a control panel that activated with a cheerful chime. Suddenly, the wall came alive with holographic displays showing what looked like a real-time military briefing. Phase 1 diversionary attacks confirmed ineffective, a mechanical voice was reporting. Enemy forces ignored all 17 feints and maintained position. Recommend immediate implementation of Phase 2. Jake stared at the display, realizing he was looking at live intelligence data from the Coalition fleet. But that wasn't the weird part. The weird part was that another voice was responding, a voice that definitely wasn't from any Coalition species he'd ever heard. Acknowledged. Phase 2 countermeasures are already in position. Their pincer movement will be neutralized before they achieve optimal formation. Recommend patience let them exhaust their resources on predictable tactics. But Jake's mouth dropped open as he realized what he was hearing. The enemy wasn't just countering coalition strategies, they were discussing them in advance, like they already knew what the coalition was going to do. He tried to back away quietly, but in his excitement, he tripped over a maintenance droid and went sprawling into the corridor, just as Admiral Vextar and half the War Council came looking for him. Commander Morrison. Vextar's voice could have flash frozen a star. What are you doing in a restricted area? I was looking for the bathroom and I accidentally activated this thing and there were voices talking about Phase 2 countermeasures and I think maybe you guys have a really big problem, Jake said in one breath, pointing at the still active display. The aliens exchanged looks that clearly said they were reconsidering their decision to invite the humans to this party. You know that moment when you're trying to explain something incredibly important and everyone's looking at you like you just claimed the moon is made of cheese? That was Jake's life for the next 30 minutes as he tried to convince a room full of genius aliens that their super-secret communications might not be as secret as they thought. Let me understand this correctly, Admiral Vextar said, his tone suggesting he was exercising the kind of patience usually reserved for dealing with small children who've just discovered crayons. You believe the Void Syndicate is somehow intercepting our secured quantum communications? I don't believe it, I heard it, Jake insisted. They were talking about your Phase 2 thing before you even finished explaining Phase 1. General Thawk made a sound that was probably laughter but sounded more like a garbage disposal having an argument with a blender. Human, our quantum encryption is theoretically unbreakable. It would require technology that exists only in hypothetical mathematics. Okay, but what if they're not breaking your encryption? Jake asked. What if they're just, listening in on a different frequency or something? The silence that followed was the kind you get when someone suggests that maybe gravity isn't really necessary after all. Counselor Blim cleared his throat nervously. Commander, our communication protocols have been developed over 3,000 years of technological advancement. The quantum entanglement matrices alone require. Right, but what's your password? Jake interrupted. I beg your pardon? Your password. For accessing the system. What is it? The aliens exchanged glances that clearly said they were beginning to suspect Jake might be experiencing some kind of neural malfunction. The access codes are generated by quantum randomization algorithms, Vextar explained slowly. They change every nanosecond based on 17 different variables including stellar radiation patterns and subatomic particle decay rates. Okay, but before you get to all that fancy stuff, what do you type in when you log onto the system? More uncomfortable silence. The initial access protocol, Blim said delicately, is necessarily somewhat standardized to ensure compatibility across all coalition systems. Which is what exactly? Vextar looked like he was developing a migraine. Administrative access is granted through the code sequence password 123. Jake stared at him. You're kidding me. It's followed by a 37-digit randomly generated suffix. But it starts with password 123. Yes, but... And you use this password for how long? The standardized portion has been in use for approximately 400 years, but... Jake was already pulling out his tablet, a piece of human technology that the aliens considered roughly equivalent to communicating through smoke signals. Okay, I'm just going to try something here. He started typing, muttering to himself about frequency modulation and basic radio theory. The aliens watched with the kind of fascination usually reserved for observing particularly primitive life forms attempting to use tools. You see, Jake explained as he worked, back on Earth we had this thing called radio, which was pretty much the first wireless communication technology we developed. And one thing we learned real quick was that if you're broadcasting on a frequency, Anybody with the right equipment can listen in. So we developed all these ways to hide our signals or encrypt them or whatever. But the thing is, sometimes the best security is just being unpredictable. His tablet beeped, and suddenly the room filled with the sound of voices, alien voices speaking in what sounded like Coalition standard. Target acquired. Nexus Prime defensive grid operating at standard parameters. No indication of enhanced security protocols. Every alien in the room went very, very still. Phase 3 assets are in position, awaiting confirmation of diversionary success before beginning primary assault. Jake looked up from his tablet to find 46 aliens staring at him with expressions that ranged from horror to something that might have been respect, if you squinted really hard. Hard, and to IA. How? Vextar whispered. Your quantum communication system is really sophisticated, Jake said, but it's broadcasting on frequencies that are basically just advanced versions of radio waves. And since you guys all evolved on different planets with different atmospheres and different background radiation, you probably never developed the same kind of radio technology we did. So you never learned that the first rule of radio is, if you can broadcast it, someone else can receive it. But the encryption is totally unbreakable, I'm sure. But they don't need to break your encryption if they can just listen to your command staff talking in clear speech over unsecured channels. Jake gestured at his tablet. This is just a basic wideband receiver. I'm picking up everything from ship-to-ship communications to what sounds like someone ordering lunch in the Coalition cafeteria. General Thawk was the first to recover from the shock. You mean they've been listening to our battle plans for 2 years? Probably longer, Jake said cheerfully. I mean, if I can figure this out with a human tablet in 15 minutes, imagine what they can do with actual advanced technology. The war room erupted into the kind of chaos usually associated with natural disasters and tax audits. 46 different species all tried to talk at once in approximately 30 different languages, creating a din that sounded like the galaxy's worst karaoke night. Admiral Vextar finally restored order by the simple expedient of activating an emergency silence field that made everyone's voice sound like they were talking through jello. Commander Morrison, he said once the chaos died down, do you have any other insights into our security protocols that might prevent the complete annihilation of galactic civilization? Jake thought about it for a moment. Well, your self-destruct codes are probably pretty easy to guess too. Why would you think that? Because you guys are really logical and organized, right? So you probably picked something that's easy to remember but follows standard security protocols. Vextar was looking distinctly pale, which was impressive considering his species was naturally blue. The self-destruct authentication code is destruct followed by the current stardate. And how often does the stardate change? Daily. So if someone wanted to blow up one of your ships, they'd just need to know what day it is. The silence that followed was the kind you get when everyone suddenly realizes they've been playing galactic poker with their cards face up on the table. If you've ever been in a meeting where someone points out that your entire business model is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of reality, you'll understand the atmosphere in the Nexus Prime war room after Jake's little demonstration. 46 of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations were coming to terms with the fact that they'd been outmaneuvered by an enemy who was essentially just eavesdropping on their conversations. So, Jake said into the stunned silence, what do you usually do when your enemy knows all your moves? Admiral Vextar looked like he was reconsidering every life choice that had led him to this moment. In theoretical terms, the optimal response would be to develop new tactical approaches that cannot be predicted using existing data. Right, but your new tactics are just going to be variations on your old tactics, aren't they? I mean, you guys have been fighting wars the same way for thousands of years. You've got doctrine and strategy guides and tactical manuals and probably entire universities dedicated to the proper way to blow things up. The principles of warfare are based on mathematical optimization and strategic logic, General Thawk protested. You cannot simply abandon proven methodologies. But that's exactly the problem, Jake said, warming up to the topic. Your proven methodologies are proving that they don't work against this enemy. You keep trying to beat them at chess when they've been reading your playbook the whole time. Counselor Blim was frantically taking notes again. What alternative do you propose? Random tactical deployment lacks strategic coherence. That's exactly what I'm proposing. Random tactical deployment. The silence that followed was the kind you get when someone suggests that maybe you should try juggling chainsaws as a hobby. You want us to abandon 3 millennia of military science, Vextar said slowly, in favor of chaos? Strategic chaos, Jake corrected. Look, the reason they've been beating you is because they can predict what you're going to do. Everything you guys do follows logical patterns based on optimal resource allocation and tactical efficiency and all that smart-sounding stuff. But what if you did things that didn't make sense? Could you provide a specific example? Blim asked, his stylus poised over his holographic notepad. Jake thought for a moment. Okay, let's say you're planning to attack one of their positions. Normal coalition strategy would be to send your fastest ships first for reconnaissance, then your heaviest ships for the main assault, with support vessels providing cover and supply lines. Right? Nods all around the table. So what if instead you sent your supply ships first, followed by a single fighter, then nothing for 3 hours, then every ship you've got all at once, but half of them are flying backwards? The aliens stared at him with the kind of expression usually reserved for watching someone try to eat soup with a fork. That, General Thok said carefully, would be tactically insane. Exactly. How do you plan a defense against something that's tactically insane? Their computers are probably designed to analyze logical strategic patterns. What happens when there aren't any patterns to analyze? Admiral Vextar was looking thoughtful, which was either a good sign or a sign that the stress was finally getting to him. The concept has a certain theoretical merit. If their predictive algorithms are based on logical strategic analysis, then illogical tactics might indeed prove effective. Plus, Jake added, it's not really random if you're randomly random on purpose. You just have to make sure you're unpredictably unpredictable, if that makes sense. It doesn't, Blim said flatly. Perfect. That means it's working. 3 hours later, they were putting Jake's strategic stupidity doctrine to the test. The coalition had a fleet of 200 ships ready to engage a Void Syndicate position in the Kepler sector. Under normal circumstances, they would have deployed in a standard formation: scouts, cruisers, battleships, support vessels, all arranged according to thousands of years of tactical wisdom. Instead, they sent in the fleet's cafeteria supply ship, followed by a single medical frigate, followed by absolutely nothing for 47 minutes, followed by the rest of the fleet arriving in random order while broadcasting polka music on all frequencies. The results were, as Jake put it, beautifully chaotic. The Void Syndicate forces, which had been positioned to counter a standard coalition assault, found themselves facing a cafeteria ship armed with nothing but food processors and a really confused cook named Henderson. Their tactical computers spent precious minutes trying to analyze the strategic significance of launching dinner rolls at enemy positions before the real attack began. By the time the rest of the coalition fleet arrived backwards, upside down, and playing music that had been banned in 17 star systems for crimes against harmony, the enemy was so confused that they forgot to shoot back until it was too late. It worked, Admiral Vextar announced to the war room, his voice carrying a mixture of amazement and existential dread. We achieved a decisive victory with 0 coalition casualties. What were their casualties? Jake asked. Complete destruction of all enemy forces in the sector. And they never figured out what we were doing? According to intercepted communications, their command structure spent the entire battle trying to determine the strategic significance of polka music. Jake grinned. So we've established that they can't handle tactical randomness. Now we just need to scale it up. General Thawk was staring at the battle reports with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had just been turned inside out and fed to a blender. You mean to tell me that the most effective military strategy in galactic history involves confusing the enemy with dinner rolls and polka music? Hey, don't knock polka music, Jake said. That stuff is seriously underrated as a psychological warfare tool. You know that feeling when you solve one problem only to discover that you've actually stumbled onto something much bigger and more complicated? That was the mood in the Nexus Prime War Room as reports came in from across the galaxy about the success of Operation Cosmic Chaos, as Jake had insisted on naming their new strategic doctrine. 17 successful engagements in the past 48 hours, Counselor Blim reported, his voice carrying the kind of amazement usually reserved for witnessing miracles or tax refunds. 0 coalition casualties, complete destruction of enemy forces in every encounter. And they still haven't adapted to our new tactics? Admiral Vextar asked. According to intelligence reports, their command structure appears to be experiencing what their communications describe as critical logic failure, Blim continued. They keep trying to analyze the strategic value of our unconventional approaches. Jake was studying a holographic display showing the locations of recent battles, and something was bothering him. It had taken him a while to figure out what it was, but now it was obvious, so obvious that he was wondering why nobody else had noticed it. Hey, he said, pointing at the display, has anyone else noticed that every time we win a battle, they respond with exactly the same tactics we would have used if we were still following your old strategies? The aliens looked at the display, then at each other, then back at the display with the kind of expression you get when someone points out that you've been wearing your shirt inside out all day. What do you mean? Vextar asked, though his tone suggested he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. Look at this, Jake said, highlighting battle data from the past week. We attack their position in Sector 7 using random tactics. They respond by deploying countermeasures that would have worked perfectly against a standard coalition pincer movement. We hit their supply lines in Sector 12 using backwards flying ships and dinner music. They counter with anti-fighter screening patterns designed to stop conventional assault formations. General Thawk was leaning forward now, his 6 eyes focusing on the tactical data with the intensity of someone who was beginning to see a very disturbing pattern. They're not adapting to our current tactics. They're responding to tactics we didn't use. Exactly, Jake said. It's like they're fighting a completely different battle than the one we're actually having. Counselor Blim was frantically cross-referencing data on his holographic display. If we analyze their response patterns against our historical tactical database, he paused, his face going pale in a way that suggested bad news was incoming. Oh no. What? Vextar demanded. Their countermeasures aren't just similar to coalition doctrine, Blim said slowly. They're identical. Every response, every tactical deployment, every strategic decision, it's exactly what the coalition would have done if we were fighting ourselves. The war room went very, very quiet. You're saying they're using our own tactics against us? Jake asked. I'm saying they are our tactics, Blim replied. Every battle plan, every strategic doctrine, every tactical manual developed by the coalition over the past 3,000 years, they have all of it. General Thawk made that garbage disposal sound again, but this time it sounded more like despair than amusement. How is that possible? Jake was still staring at the tactical display, and pieces were starting to fall into place in his mind. Not the complicated, sophisticated pieces that the aliens were used to dealing with, but the simple, yet obvious pieces that sometimes got overlooked when everyone was thinking too hard. What if, he said slowly, they're not just using coalition tactics because they stole them? What if they're using coalition tactics because they are the coalition? The silence that followed was the kind you get when someone suggests that maybe the call is coming from inside the house. That's impossible, Vextar said, but his voice lacked conviction. The Void Syndicate has technology beyond anything in coalition space. Do they, though? Jake asked. I mean, they've got ships that can destroy entire star systems, sure. But what if those aren't their ships? What if they're modified coalition ships? The energy signatures are completely different, Blim protested. Energy signatures can be faked, Jake pointed out. Back on Earth, we had criminals who would steal cars and then change the license plates and paint jobs to make them look different. Same car, different appearance. You're suggesting that the Void Syndicate is composed of coalition forces? Vextar's voice was climbing toward the upper registers of panic. I'm suggesting that maybe the reason they know all your secrets is because they learned them from the inside, Jake said. Think about it, they know your communication frequencies, your tactical doctrines, your security codes, your strategic plans. How would an outside enemy get access to all of that? Industrial espionage, General Thok suggested weakly. Or maybe, Jake continued, they're not outside enemies at all. Maybe they're coalition forces that went rogue. Maybe they're using coalition technology and coalition tactics because they used to be coalition. The implications of what Jake was suggesting were starting to sink in around the room. If he was right, then the greatest threat to galactic civilization wasn't some mysterious external enemy, it was the coalition's own military forces turned against them. We need to verify this immediately, Vextar said, his voice carrying the kind of urgency usually reserved for situations involving imminent planetary explosions. If there's even a possibility that coalition forces have been compromised. There's one way to find out for sure, Jake interrupted. We set a trap. What kind of trap? Jake grinned, and it was the kind of grin that suggested someone was about to have a very bad day, and it probably wasn't going to be Jake. The kind that only works if they really are using coalition intelligence against us. Sometimes the simplest plans are the most effective, especially when everyone expects you to do something complicated. Jake's trap was so straightforward that it took him longer to explain why it would work than it did to actually implement it. We're going to leak fake battle plans, he announced to the war room. Really obviously fake battle plans. Admiral Vextar looked like he was developing a permanent migraine. Commander, if the plans are obviously fake, won't the enemy recognize them as such? Only if they're thinking like humans, Jake replied cheerfully. But if they're thinking like coalition military doctrine says they should think, they'll analyze the plans according to standard tactical assessment protocols. Which means they'll spend so much time trying to figure out the strategic logic behind the fake plans that they won't notice the plans are fake. It was the kind of circular logic that made perfect sense if you didn't think about it too hard, which was exactly the point. The fake battle plans were a masterpiece of bureaucratic confusion. Jake had spent 3 hours creating a tactical scenario so convoluted and strategically questionable that it would have made Sun Tzu weep with frustration. The plan called for simultaneous attacks on 47 different targets using resources that didn't exist, supported by supply lines that defied the basic laws of physics, all coordinated through a command structure that reported to itself. This is either brilliant or completely insane, General Thok observed as he reviewed the fabricated documents. Why not both? Jake asked. They transmitted the fake plans using standard coalition communication protocols, making sure to include all the proper security headers and authentication codes. Then they sat back and waited to see what would happen. They didn't have to wait long. Within 6 hours, Void Syndicate forces began repositioning themselves to counter an attack that existed only in Jake's imagination. Entire fleets moved to defend targets that weren't actually going to be attacked, while strategic reserves were deployed to intercept supply convoys that would never be sent. It's working, Counselor Blim reported with barely concealed amazement. They're responding to every element of the fake battle plan as if it were genuine. Because to them it is genuine, Jake explained. They're not analyzing it as a potential deception, they're analyzing it as coalition tactical doctrine. And since it follows all the proper formatting and uses all the right terminology, their assessment protocols are treating it as legitimate intelligence. But the real genius of Jake's plan wasn't the fake battle plans themselves, it was what happened while the enemy was busy responding to them. While Void Syndicate forces were rushing around the galaxy trying to counter an imaginary offensive, Coalition forces were implementing what Jake called Operation Oops, a series of genuinely random attacks that followed no tactical doctrine whatsoever. Engagement report from Sector 15, Blim announced. Coalition forces encountered and destroyed a Void Syndicate fleet that was apparently waiting to intercept supply convoys that don't exist. Sector 23 reports complete success, Vextar added. Enemy forces were caught completely off guard by an attack they weren't expecting because we weren't planning to make it until Commander Morrison suggested it 15 minutes ago. And the big prize? Jake asked. Sector 1, Vextar said, his voice carrying the kind of satisfaction usually reserved for solving particularly difficult crossword puzzles. We've located their primary command facility. The Void Syndicate's main base turned out to be a massive space station hidden in the debris field of a destroyed solar system, a location that would have been impossible to find using conventional search methods, but was exactly where you'd expect to find it if you were thinking like a human who'd grown up watching too many science fiction movies. It's heavily defended, General Thawk reported as he studied the reconnaissance data. Defensive capabilities exceed anything in Coalition space. Of course they do, Jake said. They're using Coalition defensive technology, but they've had years to modify and improve it without having to worry about following Coalition regulations and safety protocols. So how do we attack it? Jake's grin was the kind that suggested someone was about to have a very, very bad day. With the most ridiculously stupid plan in military history. The final assault on the Void Syndicate command station involved every ship in the Coalition fleet, 300,000 tons of confetti, and the complete collected works of Vogon poetry being broadcast on all frequencies simultaneously. The attack plan was so tactically unsound that it violated several laws of physics and at least one treaty governing the humane treatment of prisoners. It worked perfectly. The station's defensive systems, designed to counter logical tactical approaches, spent crucial minutes trying to calculate the strategic value of confetti bombardment while Coalition forces closed to weapons range. The Vogon poetry apparently overloaded several enemy AI systems, causing them to shut down rather than process what one intercepted transmission described as literary torture of unimaginable magnitude. Station shields are down, reported the Coalition flagship. Enemy forces appear to be surrendering. All of them? Vextar asked. Yes, sir. They're requesting asylum and offering to provide information about Void Syndicate operations in exchange for protection from further poetry exposure. Jake laughed as the enemy commander appeared on the main communication screen, a familiar face that had been sitting in Coalition war councils for the past 15 years. Admiral Korvac, Vextar said coldly. I should have known. You should have, Korvac replied with the bitter tone of someone whose perfect plan had been ruined by complete randomness. We spent years analyzing Coalition tactical doctrine, developing countermeasures for every possible strategic approach. We could predict and counter any logical military action. But you couldn't counter illogical military action, Jake pointed out helpfully. How could we? Korvac demanded. You attacked us with supply ships. You used dinner rolls as ammunition. You broadcast poetry that caused 3 of our AI systems to request immediate memory wipes. What kind of military strategy is that? The humankind, Jake said proudly. 6 months later, Commander Jake Morrison was promoted to Admiral of Unpredictable Operations, a newly created position that came with its own budget, staff, and a mandate to ensure that Coalition military doctrine never became predictable again. His first official act was to establish the Department of Strategic Chaos, whose mission statement read simply, "If you can understand what we're doing it wrong." His second act was to implement mandatory courses in human military theory for all Coalition officers, taught by instructors who were specifically chosen for their ability to think in ways that made absolutely no sense to anyone else. And his third act was to send a memo to all coalition commanders that their new emergency authentication code was banana_hammock_42 and that anyone who complained about it would be assigned to polish the hull of the flagship using nothing but a toothbrush and determination. The Void Syndicate threat was over, but Jake Morrison's career in galactic military chaos was just beginning. After all, someone had to make sure the next group of rogue coalition officers couldn't predict what the good guys were going to do next. And as Jake sat in his new office aboard the coalition flagship, feet up on his desk, watching Admiral Vextar trying to figure out why the ship's navigation system was now programmed to play circus music every time they entered hyperspace, he couldn't help but smile. Turns out the galaxy's most dangerous secret weapon wasn't advanced technology or superior firepower, or even tactical genius. It was humans being humans, unpredictable, illogical, and absolutely impossible to plan for. Even they didn't know what they were going to do next, which made them the perfect defense against anyone who thought they could outsmart the universe by following the rules. Admiral Morrison, Vextar said, appearing in his doorway with the expression of someone who was still trying to figure out how his entire worldview had been turned upside down by a species that had discovered space travel by accident. "We need to discuss your latest proposal." "Which one?" Jake asked cheerfully. "The plan to train dolphins as tactical advisors, or the idea to replace all our ship AIs with magic 8-balls? Vextar's expression suggested he wasn't entirely sure Jake was joking. "Both," he said with the weary resignation of someone who had learned that sometimes the best way to save the galaxy was to stop trying to make sense of it. Jake grinned and reached for his magic 8-ball. After all, someone had to keep the universe on its toes,